In this video, I consider the question, was the German defeat on the Eastern Front in World War II inevitable? It is not uncommon to find Western scholars claiming that, following the failure of Operation Barbarossa and the transition of the Eastern Front into a war of attrition, Germany had little or no chance of winning in the East. This claim is usually based on the fact that by the beginning of 1942, the men and material resources of the Allies greatly surpassed those of Germany. In its failure to knock the Soviet Union out of the war quickly, Germany had therefore placed itself in a two-front war of attrition that it simply could not win. Here, I assess this claim using a novel approach. Instead of relying on isolated data points and intuitive judgments, I analyse the fighting on the Eastern Front using a computational model that is parameterized using the strength and losses datasets that I introduced in my previous video. I strongly recommend watching that video before this one, as it will provide essential background on my assumptions and general methodology. In this video, I provide a brief outline of the key aspects of my model. Viewers who are desirous of a more detail about the model should consult the document that's linked in the video description. The simulation that I use here uses monthly historical estimates for manpower, strengths, losses, and frontline strength ratios for the major combatants. These are loaded into the model, which then initializes the corresponding variables to their values at the desired initial month. By default, this is April of 1942, but that can be changed as desired, as we will see later. The simulation then computes the course of the conflict, stepping forward 1 month at a time, until the surrender condition is met. The monthly loop, which is at the heart of the simulation, so computing the relevant variables each month, works as follows. First, the strength ratio is calculated as the ratio of Soviet frontline strength to German frontline strength. Second, the loss ratio for that month is then calculated based on the strength ratio, using parameters found by regressing the loss ratio against the strength ratio, based on the data that I discussed in my previous video, where I showed that there was a strong correlation between those two variables. Third, the strength ratio is used to calculate the advance rate, which refers to how far the front line moves in a month in one particular direction or the other. Again, the parameters there are based on regressing these two variables in the historical datasets that I've constructed. This part of the simulation assumes that when the Germans have a relatively greater strength at the front, then they advance, whereas when the Soviets have a relatively greater strength, they advance. Fourth, the total losses, which is German plus Soviet casualties, are calculated based on the advance distance, again with the parameters based on regressing these two variables in the historical data. The idea there is that months of more intense fighting are typically associated with one side or other launching a major offensive, leading to higher casualties. This isn't always the case, but it's good enough for the purposes of the simulation. Finally, the losses are then computed for each side based on the loss ratio times the total losses, which are then used to update the strength for the next month by taking off losses, then adding reinforcements, and considering the frontline ratios for each combatant. As I said, when the surrender condition is met, then the total losses for each combatant over the course of the war are calculated, and we determine who was victorious. So that's a basic overview of the simulation. Now let's talk about some of the aspects in more detail. And in particular, this graph here shows how the advance rate is calculated. That is, again, how far each side advances the front line or pushes the front line forward with respect to the other side. This graph here shows the correlation between the strength ratio and the advance distance. Here, positive numbers represent advances by the Germans, whereas negative numbers represent advances by the Soviets. You can see here that the equilibrium point, that is the point where essentially there's little advance in either direction, occurs roughly around a 2-to-1 ratio. You can also see that the correlation is relatively low. It only has a value of about 0.36. That is enough to establish a relationship that can be used in the regression model in the simulation. Though there's still a lot of noise around that value, meaning that there's lots of months where the advances are going to be higher or lower than would be predicted based on the strength ratio. That leads to a great deal of trial-to-trial variation in the model, but that's not really a problem because that doesn't bias the results of the model overall. It just means that there's going to be a great deal of variation one trial to the next, which I think is appropriate given that we're trying to estimate these very complicated historical outcomes based on a small number of variables, and so a great deal of variation is appropriate. Now, at this point, there's the need to make a few clarifications about the model. The first is that it is a strategic level simulation only, with parameters based on historical data, as I discussed in the previous episode and will expand upon a little bit more here. The purpose of this simulation is to analyse whether, and under what conditions, Germany would have been able to win a war of attrition against the Soviet Union. As such, the simulation does not directly incorporate factors such as logistics, equipment, leadership, operational decisions, morale, and other factors. Now, these aspects are indirectly incorporated into the simulation through the use of historical data. So obviously, if these factors varied historically, they would have affected the historical variables like strength ratios and loss ratios and advance rates. But they're not directly incorporated because that would make the simulation too complicated and mean that there's just insufficient data to perform any sort of computation. As such, the simulation should not be used as an estimate of the outcome of a conflict that took place, say, 5 years earlier or 5 years later, or in a different location, using different technology, as then the factors would be substantially different, and the parameters used here would be inappropriate. Likewise, the model should also not be used to predict the outcome of an Eastern conflict that was drawn out for far longer than was historically the case, again because these factors would likely vary from their historical values and the parameters used would be inappropriate. As such, the simulation is hard-coded to end in June of 1947, which is 6 years after the start of Barbarossa. Despite these limitations, I think that it is appropriate to use the simulation as a way to estimate the plausibility of different historical outcomes and counterfactuals on the basis of strategic considerations. A second important point to understand is that the model is stochastic, which means that the outcome varies from one run of the simulation to the next. This means that the values of key variables are drawn from a probability distribution, so they're not deterministic. The values of the parameters of those distributions in turn are estimated using historical data. Because the historical data are noisy, especially total losses and advance rates, as shown in the graph previously, the historical data are going to result in noisy estimates. As I mentioned, this is entirely expected and appropriate given the degree of uncertainty in many of the parameters, as well as the many factors that aren't incorporated directly into the model. Trial-to-trial variation should therefore be interpreted, in my view, as representing both our uncertainty in the parameter values, plus the effects of factors that are not directly modeled, including strategic command decisions, the operational decisions of generals, the effects of weather, and other idiosyncratic, unpredictable factors of war. The model, as I said, does not assume that such factors don't matter. Indeed, I will argue that such factors can be very important in shaping the outcome of the conflict, but the simulation doesn't directly model them. Instead, it incorporates them through the impact they had on force levels, advance rates, and also the availability of reserves. A third point to be made is that the simulation does not incorporate the strength or losses of minor Axis or Soviet allies. Such an inclusion is not possible because the strength of these minor combatants was primarily determined by political factors which are outside the scope of the simulation. For example, sizable Finnish forces participated in the opening phases of Barbarossa, but for most of the remainder of the conflict they remained largely inactive, owing to the reluctance of the Finnish government to commit their forces to offensive operations against Russia. Likewise, both Hungary and Romania attempted to limit their involvement on the Eastern Front after the defeat in Stalingrad in 1943 and 44, with their contributions only increasing gradually from early 1944 as a result of mounting German pressure and the need to defend their borders against Soviet armies. In August of 1944, Romania experienced a coup and switched sides, thereafter fighting with the Soviets against the Germans. Occurrences such as these just can't be incorporated into the simulation, and any decision that I made or attempted to make in trialing different solutions to this led to a large number of ad hoc decisions that were not very plausible. Furthermore, I don't think the role of the minor combatant nations was ever very important at the strategic level. Germany's minor Axis partners contributed a maximum of 1/4 of the total Axis forces on the Eastern Front, a proportion that was reached in mid-1942 and also briefly again in mid-1944. However, owing to the much lower quality of Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian troops, as well as their equipment and leadership, I believe that as a proportion of overall fighting strength and capability, the proportion should be reduced to below maybe 10 to 15% at most. And that's only the maximum value. Typically, the proportion would have been 5 to 10% when force strengths of the minor Axis partners were lower. Now, the thing is that around 10% is within the margins of error for the German and Soviet fourth strengths on the Eastern Front. And therefore, given that these are within the margin of error, they make little difference to the overall simulation. Now, another very important aspect that must be considered about the simulation are the manpower reserves of both the Germans and the Soviet Union, particularly because this is a war of attrition. The primary purpose of the simulation, therefore, is to examine the capabilities of Germany in fighting just such a war of attrition. This is a subject that's rarely discussed in depth in popular accounts, but is of extreme importance when we're considering the outcome of the war in the East. This diagram here shows an overlay of the population distributions of Germany, which are shown in grey, and the Soviet Union in red, for working-age men as of 1941. The number of men eligible for service in the armed forces, which traditionally was ages 18 to 50, with 18 to 30 preferred for frontline service, is the ultimate limiting factor in the number of reinforcements available to replenish losses, and therefore is of grave importance when we're considering the outcome on the Eastern Front. Now, looking at this diagram, it is useful to distinguish several important different age groups. First, there are the veterans of the First World War, who, by the outbreak of World War II, were in their 40s. Next are the so-called German White Ages, which were cohorts of men who came of age between 1919 and 1932, during a time when the German army was limited to only 100,000 men and conscription was forbidden. This meant that most men in this age group did not receive any military training, hence the appellation white. By contrast, a large proportion of the men in the corresponding Soviet cohorts did serve in the armed forces for about 2 to 3 years. The third group consists of those who were born during the First World War and came of age shortly after the Nazi rise to power in Germany, and therefore received military training in Germany before the outbreak of World War II. Men of this demographic, which was substantially smaller owing to the fall in birth rates during the First World War, as you can see in both the Soviet and the German graphs here, were in their early to mid-20s at the outbreak of the Second World War. The final demographic to consider then are those who turned 18 during the critical period of 1940 through 1946, extended 1 year after the war to incorporate the fact that both Germany and the Soviet Union conscripted large numbers of 17-year-olds by the end of the war due to manpower shortages. Also note on this graph, parenthetically, the considerable decline in Soviet birth rates corresponding to the period of forced industrialization in the late 20s to early 1930s, although these men would be too young to take part in the conflict during World War II. So several observations should be made here. First, note that during the First World War, up the top of the diagram, the Russian Empire, which had similar borders to the Soviet Union, had larger numbers of available recruits than did Germany, but the ratio was not enormous, only about 1.5 to 1. By contrast, during the Second World War, you see the ratio had increased to about 3 to 1. So about twice as large an advantage in numbers in the Second World War in the Russian favour compared to the First. This may represent one overlooked reason why Germany was able to defeat Russia in World War I, even while they were fighting on 2 fronts, while in the Second World War they failed to defeat the Soviet Union despite fighting mostly only on a single front for at least the first 2 years. Of course, there were many other differences, including the fact that the Soviet Union was far more industrialized and had more effective and ruthless leadership than did Tsarist Russia. But nevertheless, the fact that they had more than twice the available manpower relative to Germany than they did in World War I may have also been a highly significant factor. The second observation to be made here is that while both the Soviet Union and Germany began the conflict with significantly smaller than usual cohorts of frontline troops, owing to the reduction in births during the First World War that I mentioned, the effect of this was far greater in Germany, as you can see here, which had a reduction of about 50% relative to pre-war birth rates, compared to only about a 20% reduction for the Soviet Union. It seems therefore that by an odd confluence of fate, Hitler came to power and reinstituted conscription at just the moment when he had actually the smallest number of young men available to bring into the military. How much this impacted the German war is difficult to say, but it potentially had quite a significant impact, and it's strange that it's seldom mentioned in historical accounts of the conflict. Turning now to cohorts of 18-year-olds coming of age during the war itself, we see that the annual increase in manpower available to the Soviet Union in the form of 18-year-old males was over 3 times as great as that available to Germany. The overall population of the Soviet Union was only about twice that of Greater Germany, illustrating how important it is to move beyond crude comparisons of entire populations and instead look at the specific numbers of combat-age men that were available. However, even this doesn't tell the whole story because, for reasons that I've not been able to entirely clarify, the Soviet Union, despite experiencing a very severe manpower shortage by later in the war, only conscripted about 50% or so of its male population who turned 18 during the war years. Whereas in Germany, the corresponding figure was about 80 to 90%, depending on exactly how you count populations of ethnic Germans in Eastern Europe. Now, as I said, I've not been able to find any very clear explanation for this discrepancy. However, I suspect that the greater proportion of German 18-year-olds who were conscripted was due to a combination of factors, including the lower efficiency of Soviet agriculture, which required more young men to stay in the fields, a diminished ability of the Soviet central government to forcibly conscript young men from more peripheral areas, such as in Central Asia or the Caucasus, as well as nutritional deficiencies in the relatively more backward Soviet Union that may have rendered a higher proportion of young Soviet males unfit for service compared to their German counterparts. But whatever the reasons, when we adjust for this difference in the rate of conscription of 18-year-olds, we find that the Soviets had about twice as many 18-year-olds added to the manpower pool every year during the war compared to the Germans. As you see here, slightly fewer in the earlier war years and slightly more in the later war years, but on average about 2 times as many. This means that in a war of attrition against Germany, casualty rates of more than 2 to 1 were unsustainable for the Soviet Union, whereas ratios of less than 2 to 1 were unsustainable for Germany. This is a highly significant result since, as we saw previously, the loss ratio never fell consistently below that critical 2-to-1 threshold until the final 10 months of the war. We can also see this key result in the following graph here, where every month above the horizontal line here shows periods of unsustainable losses for the Soviet Union, considering at a strategic level. And every month below the line represents unsustainable losses for Germany, again considering at a strategic level long term. As we see, in all the fighting prior to June of 1944, the Soviet Union was actually suffering losses at an unsustainable rate, and hence would have depleted their manpower reserves before Germany depleted its manpower reserves. Of course, at this point, this is all ignoring the fact of the opening of a second front by the Western Allies, which we'll discuss more in a moment, had a significant effect on the course of the Eastern Front as well. We can see the manpower situation a bit more clearly if we plot the available Soviet reserves of manpower over time against those of Germany. Note that this plot begins in January of 1942. If it was extended all the way back to June of 1941, the plot would be a lot harder to read because of the huge quantity of Soviet reserves that were available at the start of the conflict but were then lost over the course of 1941. So it made more sense to start at January of 1942. These figures here are estimates of the reserves of all forms of manpower potentially available for military service, including those who are currently recovering from wounds and also those who currently lacked military training. Now, this distinction is very important for operational purposes because, for example, at the beginning of 1942, Germany certainly did not have 2.5 million trained reservists available for deployment. In fact, the number was less than 500,000. And untrained men cannot immediately be deployed into combat. However, from a long-term strategic point of view, untrained but potentially fit men can be trained and sent into combat as reinforcements. And this was done by both Germany and the Soviet Union with their reserves of untrained manpower over the course of the conflict. Hence, in this graph here, we're looking at estimates of overall available manpower, including untrained but potentially fit reinforcements. So in this plot, reserves are added at each month in accordance with an estimate of the number of young men who turned 18 in each month, and are deducted in accordance with the casualties suffered. Note that in practice, recruitment was more complicated than this because it's not as if every man who turned 18 was conscripted in the very month he turned 18. Nevertheless, this is a way to approximate the reserves available at a given time. In the Soviet case, additional recruitments also became available from around 1943 onwards due to liberation of Soviet territories from German occupation, and the distinction of this is shown on the graph here in the two shades of red. In the case of Germany, the plot also shows manpower that was taken from the Wehrmachtsgefolge, or the followers, various support units of the Wehrmacht, in the final 10 months or so of the war and redeployed into the Wehrmacht proper. And again, this distinction is shown in the two shades of grey on the graph. Now, this practice meant that the Wehrmacht was denuded of its ability to conduct training, administration, construction, anti-aircraft, and all sorts of other support branches whose purpose was to support and assist in the frontline troops. This is an unsustainable and ultimately counterproductive practice, as it eventually would destroy the ability of the Wehrmacht to function and provide a continual stream of trained reinforcements. Nevertheless, this action was taken at a desperate time in the war when effectively Germany had already lost, and evidently Hitler felt that there was no other alternative and nothing to lose by that point. It should be noted that overall manpower data series are very difficult to reconstruct, and I had to make numerous estimates and assumptions in order to construct this graph. Nonetheless, I am confident that the slopes of the German and Soviet lines are fairly accurate, as they are based on casualty data and the actual number of personnel recruited into the armed forces in both countries. The positioning of the lines on the vertical axis is likely to be less precise, because this depends on assumptions about the total number of reserves that were available, potentially including personnel that were never actually drafted. In my judgment, therefore, the German line could perhaps be shifted up or down by maybe 500,000 men, depending on these assumptions, while the Soviet line could maybe be shifted up by about 1 million men or so, again depending on the assumptions one makes. However, these uncertainties don't alter the overall message of the plot, which is that for the first 2 years of the war, both powers were experiencing unsustainable losses, causing their manpower reserves to be slowly depleted. By the middle of 1943, around the time of Kursk, both Germany and the Soviet Union had effectively exhausted their manpower reserves. In order to provide reinforcements for the Eastern Front, therefore, Germany was forced in September of 1943 to alter its mobilization policies, extending the age of military service from 18 to 50 to 17 to 55, so expanding the age range, and also eliminating numbers of service exemptions from those working in industry, which up until then had continued to be relatively generous. By these measures and more draconian enforcement of existing regulations of recruitment, Germany was able to increase their reserves by about 1 million men. This was able to sustain their losses on the Eastern Front for about one more year, until the onset of the enormous losses brought on by Operation Barbarossa and other Soviet offensives around mid-44. From July of 1944 onwards, Germany had exhausted even this additional supply of manpower, and the only way they could continue to meet their needs on the Eastern Front was by cannibalizing the Wehrmachtsgefolge, which, as we've seen, was a self-defeating policy that effectively represented tacit acknowledgement of the fact that their manpower reserves had been exhausted. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was able to meet its manpower requirements by inducting millions of men from the territories they had liberated from German occupation. Without this additional source of manpower, as shown on this graph here, the Soviet Union would have had a deficit of its manpower reserves by about 5 million by the end of 1944, given the losses that they sustained during the intervening period. The importance of this Soviet reliance on manpower from occupied territories is further illustrated by this figure, which shows an estimate of the population of Soviet territories under occupation by Germany over the course of the war. Note that this includes territories that were annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 to 1940, and so represents post-war Soviet borders. This plot shows that the population under German occupation was fairly constant, around 60 million from late 1941 through to late 1943. Between August of 1943 and August of 1944, almost the entire occupied population was recovered, providing the Soviet Union with an estimated 6 million additional recruits from these liberated territories. This additional manpower came at just the time in the war when the Soviet Union had essentially depleted its existing manpower reserves. Interestingly, by the end of this period of liberation, another new source of manpower, which this time came from new allies, firstly Romania in August of 1944, followed by Bulgaria in September. Together, these two nations contributed about 800,000 troops to the Soviet side in the final 6 months or so of the conflict, which is actually more than the total that was ever contributed at any one time to Germany by Romania, Hungary, and Italy. That was a maximum of around 700,000. The lesson to take from this analysis is that had Germany been able to maintain its occupied territories in the Soviet Union for even maybe 6 months more, it is plausible that the Soviet Union would have been unable to raise the manpower needed to replenish its forces, which would have then led to a reduction in its frontline force strength on the Eastern Front. By itself, this would not have immediately led to defeat. But, as we've seen, the loss ratio and strength ratios on the Eastern Front are very highly correlated. About 75% at least of the variation in loss ratios is explained by the variation in strength ratio. And also, we've seen how the Soviet Union required a strength ratio of about 3-to-1 in order to inflict unsustainable rates of losses on the Germans, that is, loss ratios of less than 2-to-1. A reduction in the frontline Soviet strength that was brought about by failure to recapture these occupied territories would therefore have led to a positive feedback effect, in which lower Soviet frontline strength led to greater Soviet losses, which then diminished their strength and then reduced their ability to advance and capture new territories, which then would have further reduced their recruits available for manpower, further reducing their frontline strength, further reducing their ability to engage in offensive operations, and so forth. It is this complex pattern of non-linear effects and interactions which is often neglected by historians because it's sort of hard to determine when these factors become relevant, and is therefore one of the reasons why it's very useful to investigate these factors rigorously using a computational model. One final aspect of the model that is important to understand is that of the German additional losses in the West, and also something I call the German frontline ratio, or just the German ratio for short. In the simulation, German losses to the Western Allies are hard-coded to their historical values at each month. This is not ideal, but it allows the simulation to focus entirely on the Eastern Front, which is what I want to focus on here, and also permits the modification of these values of losses to the West to serve as a method of counterfactual intervention, effectively asking what difference would it have made if Germany had suffered more losses or fewer casualties to the Western Allies at a given point in the war. Similarly, the ratio of the total German forces to those forces that they had deployed on the Eastern Front is hard-coded to its historical values, and thus is also available as a point of intervention to determine the impact of Germany devoting more or fewer of its total resources to the Eastern Front. This provides a simple way of gauging how important the contribution of the Western Allies was to the defeat of Germany, which is one of the main questions I seek to address in this video. This plot then shows the magnitude of these German losses against the Western Allies, and also it shows a percentage of German personnel and divisions deployed against the Soviet Union. The casualties here include all German losses not attributable to the Eastern Front, which includes casualties at sea, pilot losses in the defense of the Reich, and losses suffered in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe. The personnel strength percentage is a lot lower than the division percentage because the personnel percentage includes all personnel in the Wehrmacht, so the Luftwaffe, the Kriegsmarine, and the replacement army, most of whom are not deployed at the Eastern Front. The division percentage is not used in my model, but it is useful as a clearer picture of the proportion of the field army that was deployed in the east. Note that following the decline in personnel strength during Operation Barbarossa, the percentage of personnel deployed in the east remained at roughly 30% of the total Wehrmacht personnel until July of 1943, when the Allied invasion of Sicily forced the Germans to begin transferring significant forces away from the Eastern Front. The large spike in losses suffered in May of 1943 corresponds to the surrender in Tunisia, where over 100,000 Germans were captured. The tremendous increase in losses following the Normandy landings in June 1944 is also clearly visible. Before now showing the results of my simulation, it is important to understand the different conditions that we're attempting to simulate. This table describes the different scenarios that we will investigate in this video. The simplest is called standard and simply initializes the simulation to its historical values and then allows the simulation to run. The idea here is to see how well the simulation approximates the historical outcome. However, it's not expected that it's always going to replicate the historical outcome, because this would be to assume that the historical outcome was actually the most likely outcome at any given point of the starting date. As I've discussed previously and will consider further below, certain events, for example the German defeat at Stalingrad, were statistically unlikely given the comparative force strengths at the time. That is, these events likely occurred as a result of factors that are not incorporated into the model, such as strategic decisions, operational decisions, weather, and other factors. And therefore, we would not always expect the historical outcome to be replicated in most runs of the simulation. The simulation tells us what would be expected to happen given the force strengths available, setting other factors to the values that they typically had over the course of the Eastern Front. Whenever there were atypical factors, again such as weather or command decisions being the most relevant potentially, then the outcomes of the simulation will not correspond to those that occurred historically. The next condition after standard is the no surrender condition. It is a minor modification of the standard condition in which the massive surrenders of personnel to the Western Allies, which occurred in April and May of 1945, do not occur. The purpose of this is simply to ensure that the simulation can proceed naturally without always being forced to terminate in May of 1945 because of the millions of troops surrendering to the West. The no West condition is an extreme one, in which the German non-Eastern losses and frontline ratios, parameters discussed in the previous section, are set to the average of their values from the months preceding the torch landings in November of 1942. Effectively, this marks the time when Germany began to deplete their forces in the east and divert forces to respond to increasing Allied pressure in North Africa and also in the air war in combined bomber offensive over Germany. The purpose of this condition, therefore, is to estimate the effect of the Western Allies on the Eastern Front by considering what would happen if the Western Allies were completely removed from the situation and the pressure on Germany from the West remained at its 1942 level for the remainder of the war. The late torch condition is a similar counterfactual, except this time it maintains German non-Eastern losses and ratio at the pre-torch levels for an additional 1 year, roughly to simulate what would have happened if the Germans had an additional year to fight on the Eastern Front before the Western Allies began to open a second front by the torch landings in North Africa. Thereafter, it's assumed that everything in the West occurred as it did historically, except 1 year delayed. This obviously is a simplification, but it provides some idea of what may have happened if the Western intervention had been delayed a year. The failed D-Day condition is a counterfactual based around what might have happened if Operation Overlord had failed, and Germany had managed to push back the Allied landing in Normandy into the sea within a few weeks or a month at most. The assumption here is that if this had occurred, the Allies would not have been able to launch a similar operation for another 9 months. This is largely an arbitrary number, a compromise between 6 months, which I think of as a lower estimate, and 12 months as a higher estimate of how long it would have taken for the Allies to try again, effectively. It's very hard to say what the Allies would have done if D-Day had failed. As far as I know, no definitive plans were ever made. I suspect the Americans would have pushed for an even bigger landing in France at some later date, and this almost certainly would have required another year's additional preparation. Churchill might have pushed for a smaller scale intervention somewhere like Greece or Norway, which he was often obsessed with. However, although this could have caused problems for Germany, I doubt that it would have had a major impact on the war. Germany pulled out of Greece in November of 1944 anyway, with the Soviet advance into the Balkans. While Germany's large garrison in Norway would probably have been able to hold out, at least in strategic locations, for many months in the mountainous terrain against an Allied incursion there. So whatever the exact case, for purposes of illustration here, I've assumed that in the event that the Normandy landings failed, the Germans would have been able to reduce their forces deployed in the West to the values that had prevailed 9 months previously, which then they would have had to gradually build up again in anticipation of a second Allied landing. This is a way of implementing the idea that Germany would have had an opportunity to temporarily transfer some forces away from the west to the east to fight the Russians, had there been a defeat of the Allied landing in Normandy. And as a result of their defeat, the Western Allies would not have been able to pose an immediate danger for at least several months as they regrouped and prepared. The final condition shown here is the early mobilization condition. And this differs from the others because it doesn't change the starting date or the frontline ratios or the numbers of casualties to the Western Allies. Instead, the purpose of this condition is to simulate what might have happened if the Germans had more fully been able to mobilize their manpower earlier in the war. Specifically, this condition assumes that Germany mobilized an additional 1 million men between mid-1940 and mid-1941, and correspondingly 1 million fewer men in the years of 1942 and 1943. The total number of recruits, therefore, is not changed, only the time in which they were inducted into the Wehrmacht. Now, this reflects an assumption that the Germans did not sufficiently prepare for a lengthy campaign of attrition in the east, and therefore did not have sufficient numbers of trained reserves available to replenish their forces in 1942, after the severe losses of Barbarossa and the Soviet winter offensives. This is reflected in German Eastern Front strengths, as we saw previously, in which there was a notable dip in mid-1942, reflecting the lack of sufficient replacement troops following the losses of 1941. To motivate this condition a bit more fully, it is helpful to consider this graph showing Wehrmacht recruitment by year until 1944. Only annual data are available, unfortunately. I've divided the recruits into rough cohorts based on when they were trained. So here we see World War I veterans, men from the white years who had little or no military training, cohorts who had received some training before the war, those who had been fully trained prior to the war, and those who turned 18 during the war and therefore obviously had not received any training before the war since they were not of age yet. This diagram shows that by 1941, the Wehrmacht had mostly exhausted its reserves of World War I veterans and those who had received training before the war. In other words, by the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Wehrmacht had very few trained reservists left. However, there were still sizable numbers of men from the white years, mostly in their 30s at this time, who had not been trained but would eventually be inducted into the Wehrmacht during the conflict. These recruits here are indicated with this yellow box and number about 2 million. So again, these are men who would eventually be inducted into the Wehrmacht during the conflict, but had not received training prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union. The significance of this is that these men were available for recruitment during the 1940 to 1941 period, unlike the top dark grey region, as those men weren't of age yet, but the men in the white region here were, and simply had not been called up and given training at that time. Now, the reasons why this was the case were many, and a large factor here was the reluctance to withdraw so many men from the war economy. This reluctance was only overcome gradually because of a combination of the necessity brought about by defeat at the front, as well as increased restrictions of the civilian economy, which freed up some additional labour, and increased usage of foreign workers. Another factor was the limited training capacity of the replacement army, which had the officers, reserves, capacity and resources to only train so many new recruits at once. Now, this capacity was greatly expanded during the war to meet the needs of training multiple cohorts simultaneously. A final factor was the belief of Hitler, and also many of his generals, that a long campaign against the Soviet Union would not be necessary, and therefore there was no need to withdraw so many men from industry. Indeed, as I'll show a bit more later, planning had already begun for a shift of priorities to the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine, away from the army, and these would have been key services needed to defeat the United Kingdom and the United States after the Soviet Union had been conquered. This type of air and sea-based warfare would have required significant industrial resources, but fewer personnel in the armed forces, hence a reason why they didn't want to recruit so many men from industry into the armed forces. My contention is therefore that the German General Staff were unrealistic about the prospects of a short war against the Soviets. As such, the early mobilization condition is used to estimate how much difference it would have made if 1 million additional men had been called up and trained during the period between the defeat of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union. While the Heer did expand and reorganize considerably during this period, I believe that more could have been done and more men could have been trained as available replacements if the will and commitment to do so had been present. After all, Germany eventually managed to train all of these additional men during a time later on in the war when it was far more engaged on various fronts and under far more pressure from Allied bombing and resource restrictions. Thus, if they could train these extra cohorts under these more difficult conditions, I believe they could have done so even more readily during the relatively peaceful period between the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union. As for the issue of withdrawing manpower from the war economy, although this would have imposed additional burdens, I believe that solutions could have been found, as indeed they were found later on in the war. The early withdrawal of an additional 1 million men from the war economy could have been partly achieved by reducing the number of discharges of World War I veterans following the fall of France. I've not been able to get a very good estimate as to the number of such discharges, but they certainly numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and possibly more. My own series of estimates shows that during this critical period of the aftermath of the fall of France, about 2 million men were discharged from the Wehrmacht, although I suspect that a sizable number of these were later reinducted when this military situation deteriorated. Additional labour could also have been freed up by slightly depressing the civilian sector, which happened later on anyway, by bringing more women into the industrial workforce, and by making greater use of foreign workers, and again that later happened anyway. A few 100,000 from each of these categories over the course of 1 year would, I think, have been quite achievable in the situation Germany was in, had the political will been present. One final concern that one may have about the early mobilisation counterfactual is whether Germany would have been able to produce the equipment required for these additional soldiers. It's important to bear in mind, first of all, that these additional 1 million soldiers in the counterfactual are not all deployed straight to the front line. Only a few 100,000 would be deployed to the front, which is governed by the frontline ratio I've been talking about. The rest of them are spread across the entire Wehrmacht, just as historical recruits were. Hence, the increase to the frontline strength of the Germans in this simulation, relative to historical levels in the counterfactual that I'm considering here, is only about 15%, going from 2.7 million in 1942 in the historical case to about 3.1 million in this counterfactual case of early mobilisation. Now, as to whether even this modest increase could have been equipped by the Germans during 1942, I believe the answer is a clear yes. This slide here shows some statistics to illustrate how misallocated German industrial resources were during this critical period between the fall of France and the invasion of the Soviet Union. We see here that from quarter 2 of 1940 to quarter 3 of 1941, the share of the steel allocation to the Heer, the German army, which is a useful proxy for overall industrial priority and capacity, fell from 40% down to 20% before rising sharply back up again over the course of 1942, back to 40%. This decline in inputs is reflected by a proportional decline in outputs, as shown in the second graph here, in which the share of output for the Heer fell from 60% in 1939 to 30% in 1941, before slowly rising back up again to 60% by 1943. This reduction in the priority of the Heer and increased priority of the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine was based on the assumption that the victory over the Soviet Union would be swift, and hence resources should be diverted now to the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine to prepare for the war against the United Kingdom and the USA. This made strategic sense, but only on the assumption of a short campaign. As many others have argued, this assumption was based largely on faulty intelligence, gross underestimation of the capacity of the Soviet state, plain old wishful thinking, and racist attitudes towards Slavic peoples. Had the proper planning been carried out to accurately assess the manpower and industrial capacity of the Soviet Union, analysis which, from my reading, was only carried out in early 1942, it should have been clear to the Germans that they had no realistic chance of defeating the Soviet Union in 1941, due to logistical limitations if nothing else. As such, the Germans should have planned on a campaign that would last at least 2 years. Had this assumption been made at the outset of German planning, resources would not have been prematurely diverted away from the Heer, and significantly more tanks, artillery, shells, and other equipment would have been available for the Eastern Army, easily enough to supply the modest increase required in the personnel strength of the counterfactual considered here. Now, the final graph we see here shows the mobilisation of Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom measured as a fraction of their GDP devoted to the military. Such comparisons are problematic for a number of reasons, particularly because all three nations received significant foreign military assistance. Germany received it from its European conquests and satellite nations, and the UK and the USSR received a large amount of American Lend-Lease. These inflate the percentages since they represent resources available for war uses that did not have to come from domestic production. However, even in 1940, before either of these became major factors, we see that the United Kingdom was slightly more mobilised than Germany, despite starting from a much lower baseline in 1939. Also note how rapidly the USSR managed to mobilise between 1941 and 1942. In comparison, Germany's mobilisation was much slower, even if by the end of the war they had surpassed both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union in mobilisation percentage. Even a modest increase from 0.4 to, say, 0.45 in 1940 would have meant a 10% increase in military output. Alternatively, this could have been used to withdraw manpower from the civilian economy and divert more personnel into the Wehrmacht while keeping output at the same level. In either case, the point is to illustrate the argument that I made earlier, which is that during the period from around mid-1940, the defeat of France, to mid-1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union, there was enough capacity available in the German economy to train and equip hundreds of thousands of additional replacements for the army in the East, had the will and the planning been available to do so. Thus, I believe that my early mobilisation counterfactual would have been possible for Germany to complete, although perhaps implausible in the light of Hitler's attitudes towards the Soviet Union and Slavic peoples in general. It's now time to turn to the results of the simulation model. I will first present several individual illustrative runs to show how the model works and help to visualise key factors at play. Note that these are only single runs, and as I've said, there's a lot of variation from one run to the next, and so they're presented as illustrative examples and not as the final definitive result. So first we will consider a German victory in the standard simulation beginning in August of 1942. On the screen here, you will see a table showing field strengths, losses, and armed forces strengths, as well as advance rates for each month and a total cumulative advance rate. On the right, you can see a map depicting the progress of the simulation. Note that the map is based on the rate of advance as determined by the simulation. However, the specific regions that change hands are predetermined and for illustrative purposes only, as the model has no ability to simulate the gain or loss of individual particular territories. In this run of the simulation, we see some back and forth over the course of 1942 and early 43, but in the course of this fighting, the Soviets experience much higher losses than do the Germans. Notice that Germany experiences lower than historical losses in 1942, and hence is able to sustain a larger than historical strength on the Eastern Front. This in turn means a lower strength ratio and higher relative losses for the Soviets. As a result, by late 1943, you can see that the Soviet manpower situation is becoming critical, and they are unable to maintain a large enough field army at the front. This is due to a combination of the ongoing heavy losses, as well as their failure of the Soviets to recover the territories in the Ukraine, which holds several million key potential recruits. While heavy fighting occurs during 1944, eventually the collapse of the Soviet military leads to German victory in early 1945. Now considering a case in which the Soviets achieve victory, we note that while experiencing significant losses, the Soviets managed to recapture here the east bank of the Dnieper by the end of 1944, providing them with significant additional manpower from these liberated territories. We also see that the strength ratio is consistently much higher here than in the previous scenario, leading to proportionally higher casualties for the Germans and lower casualties for the Soviets. By the end of 1944, Soviet frontline strength has been depleted, but German strength has been depleted even more. So the strength ratio is still higher than it was for the Soviets in 1942. This allows the Soviets to continue their advance and ultimately achieve victory by mid-1945. We now turn to the early mobilisation condition beginning in April of 1943. This early mobilisation of reserves allows Germany to replenish their losses more fully, allowing them in this case to field an army in 1943 larger than they were able to historically. This in turn enables them to both hold the eastern Ukraine and also inflict greater losses on the Soviet Union during the offensives there. The consequences are by now familiar. The Soviet Union experiences higher losses, which depletes their frontline strength, preventing them from recovering the territories needed to gain additional recruits, and thereby leading to even higher losses in the future. This feedback effect in the particular situation leads to a case where the Soviet Union's forces become so depleted that they're forced to surrender by early 1945. We now consider a late torch scenario where the Allied invasion of North Africa is delayed by 1 year. Here we observe that Germany is able to build up a force of 3.4 million men, which is the maximum that's allowed in the simulation, owing to the fact that they did not need to divert forces to respond to the Allied landings in North Africa as they did historically. As with the previous simulations, this greater strength leads to much higher losses for the Soviet Union and enables Germany to maintain their occupied territories, thereby cutting off reinforcements to the Soviets. As before, this leads to a gradual grind down of Soviet reserves, leading to German victory in early 1945. The final scenario we consider here is that of failure of Allied landings in Normandy. While the scenario does allow Germany time to redeploy some forces to the Eastern Front, in most cases this is simply too little too late and the Germans are still defeated. However, in a small fraction of the simulations, Germany is able to perform a sufficiently large and particularly successful counteroffensive on the Eastern Front, which then inflicts significant enough losses to the Soviet Union and recaptures enough territory that Germany is then able to redeploy some of their forces back to the west and still have enough forces deployed on the Eastern Front to fight against the Soviets for long enough to deplete their reserves. In this case, we see that this combination of factors leads to a German victory, at least on the Eastern Front, by mid-1946. As I mentioned, the examples that I've shown are only individual runs, and there's a great deal of variation from one to the next. To provide a more comprehensive picture of the outcome of a given simulation condition, we can plot a histogram of how often each nation achieves victory and how long the war lasts in different cases. In this historical condition shown here, starting in April of 1942, we observe that the war typically lasts until the middle of 1945, slightly longer than historically. These results indicate that absent catastrophic and statistically unlikely defeats like Stalingrad, the Germans would likely have defeated the Soviet Union, but doing so would have taken them about 4 years from the initial invasion. Whether Germany would have been able to successfully defend itself against the Western Allies for this long, even in the case of Soviet defeat, is another question entirely, which is not really addressed by this model. If we now consider the histogram beginning in April of 1943, we see similar results, but now with a much higher proportion of Soviet victories, given that the starting point is now after the German defeat at Stalingrad. Now examining the histogram of the early mobilization conditions starting in April of 1943, we see that the proportion of Soviet victories has shrunk dramatically. This reflects the greater ability of the Germans to replenish their losses after Stalingrad had more trained reserves been available at that time. These results indicate that Germany could still have defeated the Soviet Union even after their losses at Stalingrad, but that insufficient preparation earlier in the war had meant that the necessary replacements were not available soon enough. Also note here that the duration of the war is largely unaffected relative to the standard historical case. As I mentioned, this leaves open the question of whether it would have been possible for Germany to survive against the further intensification of effort by the Western Allies over the course of 1945 had Germany not been defeated already in April, as was the case historically. But this further intensification is not incorporated into the simulation, as it's purely speculative. Finally, we see here the histogram of what would have happened in the failed D-Day condition. Note that the Soviet Union still defeats Germany in the large majority of cases, and the times when Germany does manage to win involve them prolonging the war out into 1946 or even 1947, which is necessary for them to allow sufficient time to wear down Soviet reserves. Again, whether Germany would have been able to survive for an additional 18 to 24 months against further intensification of attacks in the West is a further question. Nevertheless, what I think this result shows is that if the Germans had been able to defend against the Normandy invasion, there is at least a chance they would have been able to successfully counterattack in the East and wear down the Soviets enough to have perhaps brought about a negotiated peace. It is now time to consolidate the information from all of the historical conditions that we have considered. This graph shows all of the historical simulation conditions that we have considered so far: the historical case, the early German mobilization case, the late torch case, and also the no West condition. Rather than selecting a single initial point for each simulation to begin, this graph plots the proportion of German victories when the simulation is started at each different month from March of 1942 all the way up to March of 1945. I also have fitted a sigmoid curve through each set of points, which represents a guess of Germany's overall chances of being able to win the war as of that date in the relevant simulation condition. And remember that the probabilities here represent aspects not captured by the simulation, so include political decisions, operational plans, weather, the vicissitudes of battle, and other such factors that can be thought to vary from one run of the simulation to another. Starting with our historical condition, we first must address, before further consideration, the aberrant points here of April, May, and June of 1942, where you can see they're far off from all of the other values and don't seem to fit in the pattern, and therefore were not used in plotting the sigmoid curve that's shown as a line here. The reason for these highly divergent results can actually be shown to stem from a quirk in the data that are used to calculate the Wehrmacht frontline strength, particularly in April of 1942. As you can see here, there is an odd bump in the Wehrmacht total strength around April of 1942, and a reduction in a couple of months afterwards. I decided to leave this in the data because it was present in the source material, but I don't have any explanation for this anomaly, and I suspect that it's a statistical artifact. There seems no logical reason why the Wehrmacht would have shrunk in size during these months when the Eastern Front was largely quiet and the Germans were building up for an offensive in the East. Returning therefore to the main plot, and focusing on the sigmoid curve, which represents an averaged consideration over individual months, we see that Germany's estimated chances of winning the war fell rapidly over the course of 1943. Much of this fall occurred as a result of the defeat at Stalingrad, which alone was responsible for at least a 20 percentage point reduction in Germany's chances of winning, which can be observed from February to March of 1943. By the end of 1943, Germany's chances of winning in the East had fallen to below 10%. And this residual chance that's shown in December of 1943 is my estimate of how likely it was that they could still have defended from the Allies at D-Day and then counterattacked against the Soviets. Even this small residual chance is gone by September of 1944, after which the chances of achieving even a limited victory against the Soviets is effectively zero. It is sobering to note that of Germany's 5 million total military deaths during World War II, a full 2 million of these, 40% of the total, were sustained during the final 10 months of the war, by which time there wasn't even a faint hope of changing the outcome of the conflict. Considering now the early mobilisation condition, we see that a German victory is a near certainty until the second half of 1943. This counterfactual must be interpreted with some caution, as the simulation assumes that the war progressed as it did historically, until the start of the given month when the simulation was begun. Now, obviously this is unrealistic, because if Germany had mobilised greater numbers of reserves during 1940 and 1941, then obviously events wouldn't have proceeded as they did historically, all the way up to 1943 before diverging. They would have diverged earlier. However, the point of this graph is to provide a way of illustrating how much difference a given counterfactual makes relative to Germany's chances in the historical case. So it provides a way of estimating how important the counterfactual was. So one way to see this is to observe that the early mobilisation condition pushes back the time when Germany's chances of victory fell below 10% from the end of 1942 in the historical case out to the end of 1943 in the counterfactual case, so over a year later. A 1-year delay in the onset of Operation Torch has an even greater effect, delaying the 50% cutoff period that I just mentioned by a further 6 months until mid-1944. And finally, removing the Western Allies altogether practically guarantees German victory in the East, pushing the 50% cutoff to early 1945. The point here is not to say that these are the precise estimates of how likely it would have been for Germany to win the war, but rather I think that it provides a way of estimating the relative importance of different effects. In particular, the effect of delayed German mobilization was highly significant, but the effect of increasing Western pressure was even greater in forcing Germany to withdraw its forces from the east and thereby reducing its effectiveness and allowing the Soviets to gain more ground. We also see from this graph how important was the failure of the German offensive of 1942, and particularly the German defeat at Stalingrad in leading to a reduction in Germany's chances of winning the war. Note that in several of the conditions we also see a spike around July of 1943, which corresponds to an increase in German strength on the east at the Kursk offensive. I think that these sorts of dips and spikes largely result from idiosyncratic aspects of the model and should not be interpreted too closely. I think the better fit to look at is the overall sigmoid curve, which is why I've plotted those in addition to the dots, which are the actual outcome of the simulations. Now, as a final accompaniment to the simulation data, this slide shows my estimates of the total economic output devoted by both Germany and the Soviet Union to supporting their military activities on the Eastern Front. For the USSR, this is effectively just their GDP times the fraction spent on the military. But for Germany, adjustments must be made for the estimated proportion that they devoted to the Eastern Front, as well as adjusting for the military contributions of their occupied territories. However, after this adjustment, what we observe is perhaps not surprising. The Germans had an advantage in 1941 owing to the fact that the Soviets had not yet mobilized. Rough parity is observed in 1942, and from 1943 onwards, Germany had to devote more and more of its resources towards other fronts, while increased Lend-Lease, aid, and recovering of lost territories helped to boost the Soviet economic output. German production was also hampered in the later years of the war by Allied bombing, blockade, lack of critical raw materials, particularly oil and rubber, and the increasing shortage of industrial manpower. Indeed, the content of this graph is one of the main reasons why Hitler planned on a short war against the Soviet Union in the first place, since it was Hitler's belief that if they failed to win a decisive early victory, Germany would not have the industrial capacity or manpower reserves to fight a prolonged war of attrition against the Soviet Union, plus the United Kingdom, both of which would have been backed by the industrial might of the United States. This perspective is reflected in Hitler's prescient quote on the matter in the summer of 1942. He said, "If I do not get the oil of my cup in Grozny, then I must finish this war." And here Hitler was essentially correct. Germany failed to capture the oil or achieve a decisive victory in the East by the end of 1942. Thereafter, increasing pressure from the Western Allies meant that Germany was unable to deploy the forces that were necessary to defeat the Soviet Union. Let me now summarize the key findings from this and also the previous video. First, Germany failed to prepare for a prolonged war in the East. Had they done so during the period of 1940 to 1941, they would likely have been able to defeat the Soviet Union in 1943 or 1944. Second, Germany's defeat at Stalingrad was critical. Before this, the chances of victory against the Soviet Union were about 2/3, whereas afterwards they fell to less than 1/3. 3. Soviet manpower reserves were close to being exhausted by the middle of 1943. Only through recruitment from liberated territories were they able to maintain their force level, given the enormous casualties that they'd been suffering. This feedback effect whereby success in Soviet offensives led to liberation of more recruits, which allowed the frontline strength of the army to be maintained and therefore permitting more successful offensives, was vital and is underappreciated in conventional historical analysis. My simulations indicate that the reverse effect could easily have occurred, whereby if the Soviet Union failed to retake these territories in 1943, their manpower reserves would have been depleted, thereby reducing their force strengths on the Eastern Front, thereby leading to higher rates of losses against the Germans, which would have potentially led to a German snowball and defeat of the Soviet Union by perhaps 43 or 44. Fourth, when adjusted for their numerical superiority, the performance of the Soviet military was quite poor. On average, the Soviets inflicted only about 1/6 as many casualties per man as did the Germans, and only about 1/10 as many kills per tank. Fifth, the increasing diversion of German men and material to fight against the Western Allies was decisive in enabling German victory in the East. Absent the increasing Western pressure from late 1942 onwards, in the form of the Torch Offensive plus the Combined Bomber Offensive, it is unlikely that the Soviet Union would have been able to be victorious. Finally, the success of Operation Overlord in June 1944 effectively sealed Germany's fate, and thereafter, any sort of victory, even a limited victory on the Eastern Front, was an essential impossibility. To sum up, the outcome of the titanic struggle between Germany and the Soviet Union defined the course of the 20th century. Soviet victory meant the end of Germany as an independent military power, and the domination of half of Europe by the Soviet Union for the next 50 years. Every nation in Central and Eastern Europe was profoundly affected by the conflict, and its consequences still loom large to the present day. Hitler and the German High Command were fully aware of the monumental task they were undertaking when planning and executing Operation Barbarossa. It is astonishing, therefore, that so little effort was made to plan for the possibility of a prolonged conflict. By contrast, Soviet mobilization following the German invasion was swift and intense. Furthermore, the Allies made good use of their material advantages and cooperated effectively to bring the war to a victorious end. By contrast, poor German planning and ineffective use of their resources lost them the war. Good Soviet planning and effective use of their resources won them the war.